"It's painful down there too," whispered the Apache woman to the cowboy as dust swirled around them. A trail of blood darkened the grass where she'd fallen, and the wind carried the smell of gunpowder. He reached for the arrow buried deep in her side, knowing one wrong move could finish her. But in a land where mercy costs lives, can a man's trembling hands save a stranger, or doom them both beneath the desert sun? The prairie lay silent except for the rasp of wind through yellow grass. A rider had found her there at dawn. An Apache woman collapsed beside a dry creek, her horse long gone, the prints of pursuit still fresh in the dirt. She clutched her thigh and ribs, the wounds dark and spreading, and her voice barely carried when she told him to pull the arrow out. He wasn't a doctor, just a ranch hand with steady hands and too many ghosts. Still, something in her eyes, defiance more than fear, stopped him from walking away. He glanced over his shoulder. No one followed yet, but he could feel the weight of the horizon pressing close. A single vulture circled overhead. He dropped his canteen beside her and knelt. The shaft of the arrow had snapped, leaving only the buried head and a slow pulse of blood. If he waited, she'd die. If he touched it, she might die faster. The choice cut through him sharper than any blade. "Hold on," he said, wrapping a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt around the wound. Her fingers tightened on his wrist, stronger than he expected. He saw in that grip a warning and a plea at once. "Don't leave me, but don't let me owe you either." The line between mercy and trespass felt thinner than the arrow he meant to pull. Above them, the sun climbed higher, throwing their shadows long and crooked against the ground. He could already taste the danger that would come once others saw a cowboy tending an Apache woman. The frontier had laws sharper than bullets and hearts harder than the stones beneath his knees. But as she fought for breath, he found himself fighting too, not against her, but against the cold voice inside that whispered she was already lost. When the wind shifted, it carried the distant echo of hoofbeats. He looked up, squinting toward the ridge. The riders were still too far to name, yet close enough that every second mattered. He pressed his palm to the wound, feeling her heartbeat flutter like a trapped bird. He knew the next moment would define them both. Pull the arrow now, or run before the riders arrived. The cowboy pressed his palm tighter against the wound, feeling the warmth of life ebbing through the torn cloth. The Apache woman's breath rasped in short bursts. Each one felt like a small victory against the emptiness waiting around them. Above, the sky had turned the color of iron, and thunder rolled somewhere beyond the ridge. Storm or pursuit, he couldn't tell which. He spoke little, only what mattered. "Keep still." Arrows deep. Her eyes met his, dark and steady. "You pull, I die slow. You leave, I die fast." The words weren't a plea, they were terms. He took a breath and reached for the haft. The broken shaft splintered under his fingers. He stopped, too close to bone. "Then break the bone," she whispered. The challenge in her tone startled him more than the blood. A single crack of thunder answered. He wrapped the cloth again, tighter, turning her own belt into a tourniquet. The leather creaked as he twisted it with a stick. She gritted her teeth but didn't cry out. For a moment the prairie went utterly still, the air thick with the smell of rain and iron. When he looked up, a wall of dust was rolling across the flats, hoofbeats buried inside it like a heartbeat he could feel through the ground. He dragged her toward the dry wash, half lifting, half pulling until they reached the shelter of a fallen cottonwood. She tried to help, pushing with her good leg, but the effort stole what strength she had left. By the time he laid her down beneath the roots, her skin was pale as ash. "Who's coming?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Men who burn what they don't understand." "Yours or mine?" "Both." The answer chilled him. Somewhere out there, blue coats and painted faces hunted each other, and anyone caught between was counted as neither friend nor foe. He checked his rifle, one cartridge left, and cursed under his breath. Rain began to fall in wide, heavy drops. The smell of it struck first, clean and cruel. He covered her with his coat, then crouched low beside the trunk, scanning the rim of the wash. The hoofbeats were louder now, maybe a mile off. Behind him, she murmured something in her tongue. He caught only one word: water. He filled the canteen from the puddles forming in the mud and held it to her lips. She drank, then pushed his hand away. Pride, even on the edge of death. "Why'd they shoot you?" he asked. She hesitated, rain tracing lines through the dirt on her face. "Because I carry words, not weapons. They fear words more." He stared at her, uncertain if she meant it literal or not. A courier, maybe. A message runner between tribes, or between tribes and the army. If she lived, she might know something worth killing for. The hoofbeats stopped. Silence heavier than thunder pressed down. Then came the whistle of a bullet striking bark above his head. He grabbed the rifle and fired once into the open plain, aiming at the flash of movement he glimpsed through the rain. The echo folded back over the wash, followed by shouts. He dropped beside her again. "Can you move?" She nodded weakly. "If you help." He pulled her arm over his shoulder and started toward the narrow cut that led deeper into the ravine. Mud clung to their boots, each step slower than the last. Another shot cracked behind them, chipping rock. The next one would find flesh. They stumbled into a hollow barely wide enough for two bodies and slid down the slick clay wall. He tore off his hat, gasping for air. The woman's hand found his sleeve, fingers trembling but determined. "You should have left me," she said. He shook his head. "Too late for that." Lightning split the clouds, throwing white fire across the ravine. For an instant, he saw the riders crest the ridge, 3 silhouettes against the storm. The flash faded, and darkness swallowed them again. The woman tried to speak, but her voice broke into a cough. He pressed his hand against her chest to steady her breathing. Her heart still beat, faint but fierce. "We wait till night," he said. "Then we move." She nodded once. "If we live that long." Another rumble of thunder rolled over the plain. Between heartbeats and rain, they listened for the next sound, the one that would decide if mercy had bought them salvation or just delayed the inevitable. The rain stopped before sunset, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the storm. The cowboy scraped mud from his boots with a stick, every motion slow, listening for anything beyond the whisper of dripping leaves. The woman slept beside him, her breathing shallow but steady. Blood had dried around the bandage in a dark crust. He knew she needed a fire, but smoke would draw the riders like a lantern in the dark. He checked the rifle again. 1 cartridge, a gambler's chance. Twilight came quick in the canyon. Shadows stretched over the ravine, turning rock into shapes that seemed to move when he blinked. He leaned back, closing his eyes for what he told himself would be a minute. Hoofbeats woke him, close this time, echoing off the walls. The sound of men speaking low, then the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. He nudged her shoulder. "Wake up, they're here." Her eyes opened, clear despite the fever. "You can still run." "And leave you?" She didn't answer. The question had no clean edges. He pointed toward a narrow slit in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a person. "Through there," he whispered, "leads to a dry tunnel. We stay low." She pushed herself up, wincing. He half carried her, feet sliding on wet stone, until the gap swallowed them in darkness. Inside, the air was cold and still. The space smelled of dust and old fire. Someone had hidden here before. They moved by feel, palms against rock. Behind them, voices bounced along the canyon floor. "She can't have gone far," one man called. Another answered. "The scout said the trail ends here." Then silence. Boots scraping. The cowboy held his breath. Their match flared outside, a small orange bloom lighting the entrance. The beam touched the mud where they had crawled, then stopped. A voice muttered something, too soft to catch, and the match went out. The sound of retreating footsteps followed. When they were gone, he exhaled for the first time in a full minute. The woman leaned against the wall. "Why help me?" He rubbed a hand across his face. "Because I've done worse than walk away." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "but it's the truth." She watched him for a long moment. Then, quietly, "My people think every life has a circle. Maybe you're part of mine." He didn't know what to say. The words carried something gentler than gratitude, heavier than trust. When the sky outside turned black, they crawled deeper until the tunnel widened into an open shelf of rock overlooking the valley. The storm had cleared the air. Stars burned bright and close enough to touch. In the distance, campfires dotted the plain, 3 of them, spread wide, patient. They're waiting, he said. She nodded. Waiting means they fear what comes next. He studied her face in the starlight. Fever had painted color into her cheeks, but her eyes still burned steady. You said you carry words, he murmured. What words are worth dying for? She hesitated. A treaty. One that could end the raids. Army knows. They knew, then changed their minds. He let that sink in. The war out here never truly ended. It just changed names and uniforms. Maybe that was why he couldn't bring himself to hand her over. Maybe he was tired of burying people he didn't hate. A coyote's cry echoed through the valley. The fires below flickered, men moving about. Dawn would bring search parties. Dogs. Maybe worse. He looked at her, then at the single cartridge gleaming in the chamber. You got a plan? She asked. He gave a dry laugh. Pray the river's high and the horses tired. She almost smiled. Then we move before dawn. They sat in silence. The wind smelled of wet sage and smoke. Somewhere down below a horse whinnied. The cowboy pulled his coat around her shoulders. Try to sleep. I'll keep watch. Her voice came soft through the dark. If they catch us, he answered without looking at her, then they'll learn what a cornered man does when he's done running. The night stretched thin and restless. When the first pale light touched the horizon, he rose, tightened the strap on his rifle, and helped her to her feet. The ground below shimmered with mist. Every step ahead promised either freedom or a bullet. As they started down the slope, a single crow lifted from a dead tree, cawing into the dawn. Its wings caught the first sunlight, black against the sky. He took that as a sign, maybe warning, maybe blessing, and kept walking. The dawn came thin and gray, the kind that offered light without warmth. The cowboy and the Apache woman moved along the ridge, keeping low, following the faint cut of an animal trail. Below them, the valley stretched wide and empty, but the mist hid too much. Every echo sounded like pursuit. She limped beside him, one arm across her ribs, breath shallow but steady. Each step left a darker stain in the dust. He wanted to stop and rest her, yet the open sky above felt like a loaded gun pointed down. A hawk circled high overhead. He took it as warning. They reached a fork in the ridge, a narrow drop to the left that led toward the river and a stony rise to the right. He studied the ground. Tracks'll vanish in water, he said. But we'll be seen getting there. She scanned the horizon. High ground buys time, river buys distance. He almost smiled. You sound like a soldier. Messengers learn to think like the men who chase them. Hoofbeats rolled through the morning fog before he could answer. Not far, maybe half a mile. He took her hand and led her down the slope toward the riverbank, loose rock skidding beneath their boots. The descent jarred her wound. Blood seeped through the bandage again, bright against the pale clay. She didn't make a sound. At the bottom, the river wound between steep walls of shale, fast from the night's rain. The current looked mean, but passable. He tested it with his boot, cold enough to steal breath. We cross here, he said. She shook her head. If I fall, you can't lift me. Then you don't fall. He slung the rifle over his back, looped one arm around her waist, and stepped into the torrent. Water bit through cloth and skin. Each step felt heavier, the bottom shifting beneath them. When they reached midstream, a shout echoed behind, a rider on the ridge pointing down, sunlight flashing on his badge. Go, he barked, half pushing her through the current. The woman stumbled, but kept her footing. A bullet struck the water nearby with a hiss. Another whined past his ear. They fell the last few feet onto the opposite bank, crawling behind a boulder slick with moss. She coughed, spitting river water, eyes wide. They saw us. Good, he said. Now they'll think we're drowning. He dragged branches into the current, enough to look like bodies swept away, then guided her into a narrow gap between the rocks. They waited, listening. Across the river came shouting, then the pounding of more horses. The riders clustered on the far bank, searching, firing once into the water before turning upstream. The echo faded with them. Only then did he breathe again. His hands trembled from cold and exhaustion. You still with me? She nodded, lips blue but eyes fierce. You'd risk dying for someone you don't know. He stared at the river. I know enough. You bleed red, same as me. For a long while neither spoke. The wind carried the smell of sage and smoke. The riders had lit another camp somewhere downstream. They couldn't stay here. He gathered what dry sticks he could and struck a small flame hidden behind the rock wall. The warmth returned, feeling to their fingers. Steam rose from their soaked clothes. She watched the firelight dance across his face. "When this ends," she said quietly, "what will you tell your people?" "That I did what I could," he replied. "That's all a man's allowed." "And if they call you traitor?" He shrugged. "Then I'll stop answering." The wind shifted, bringing a faint metallic scent, iron and smoke again. He rose, peering through the haze. On the far ridge, a glint of movement. Another patrol, maybe new, maybe the same men circling back. He doused the flame with his boot. "Time to move." She struggled to stand, leaning on his arm. "Where?" "West. There's an old line shack beyond those hills. If we make it by dark, we rest. After that, you head south. I'll draw them off." Her eyes met his. "You wouldn't come back?" He said nothing. The silence between them said enough. They started west, two figures against the brightening sky, leaving no trail except the faint scent of smoke and river mud. Behind them, the water carried the branches downstream like ghosts. At the top of the rise, the cowboy paused and looked back once more. The sun had broken through the clouds, painting the valley gold. Somewhere out there, men hunted by law and orders they barely understood. He touched the last bullet in his pocket, a reminder of how thin the line was between mercy and survival. Beside him, the woman adjusted her shawl and whispered, "The land remembers kindness." He answered, "Then let it remember this day." They turned west again, walking into the light, unaware that one of the riders had already spotted the glint of their movement against the hills. By midday the heat returned, burning the mud to dust and the smell of rain out of the air. The pair followed a faint cattle trail that wound between low ridges. Every step pressed grit into their boots and reopened old aches. The woman's wound had stopped bleeding, but darkened beneath the bandage, a spreading bruise of purple and brown. The cowboy knew the signs of fever when he saw them. They rested in the shadow of a stone outcrop. He poured a trickle of water into the cap of his canteen and held it out. She shook her head. "Save it. You'll need it more than I will. Not if they find us first." He studied the horizon, flat light, no motion except a hawk circling above the far ridge. He didn't trust the stillness. Out here, silence was never empty. It was what came before sound. They moved again when the sun tilted west. The land began to climb, dotted with mesquite and brittle grass. At last, a shape appeared ahead, a small shack leaning against a bluff, its roof half gone but still standing. The sight drew something close to relief from him. "Shelter," he said. She nodded, swaying slightly as they approached. Inside smelled of dust and old leather. A broken cot lay against one wall, a rusted stove against another. He helped her sit, then checked the corners for snakes. When he returned, she was watching him with that same guarded calm. "I've been here before," she said. He looked around. "Long time ago, when the line still ran cattle through this pass. Before the soldiers came. Before everyone forgot what side they were on." He found a half-rotted crate, broke it apart, and built a small fire in the stove. The smoke slipped through the holes in the roof, thin enough not to betray them. He warmed water in a dented pan and cleaned her wound. She winced but didn't pull away. "You shouldn't touch it," she murmured. "Bad spirits follow blood." He kept working. "Spirits already got my share." For a while there was only the sound of the fire ticking. Outside, wind dragged across the grass, bringing the distant echo of a whistle, 3 notes miles far apart. He stiffened. A signal, someone sweeping the valley below. He put a finger to his lips. The woman's eyes flicked toward the door. Hoofbeats followed, slow, deliberate. 1 rider, maybe 2. They passed close enough for the boards to tremble. He held his breath, hand on the rifle, counting heartbeats. The sound faded downhill, swallowed by wind. Still he waited a full minute before lowering the gun. She let out the breath she'd been holding. "They hunt like wolves. They learned from men who hunted wolves." He checked the door latch, weak but serviceable, and shoved a plank across it. When he turned back, she was staring at the fire. her face drawn tight. "My brother carried the treaty," she said softly. "They shot him before he reached the fort. I took the paper from his hand and ran. It's hidden now. Here. No, close enough that dying for it still makes sense." He felt the weight of her words settle between them. If the paper was real, if it promised what she said, then every lawman out there wanted her dead before the ink ever dried. Night crept in, painting the shack blue and gold. He fed the last scraps of wood into the stove and sat beside her. Outside, coyotes called, thin and mournful. "You trust me yet?" he asked. "I trust what you do," she answered. "Not what you say." "That's fair." They fell quiet. The fire shrank to embers, leaving only the sound of the wind through the broken roof. He thought of the riders, of the single bullet in his rifle, of the woman beside him, carrying a secret worth dying for. Every road west led back to the same truth. Some debts can't be paid with money or blood, only with choice. A faint glimmer appeared through a gap in the boards, lantern light moving across the plain. Another, then another, spreading like stars in the wrong part of the sky. "They've found the trail," he whispered. She closed her eyes. "Then the circle ends here." He shook his head. "Not yet." He doused the fire with sand, grabbed the rifle, and shouldered his pack. Through the cracks he could see at least 3 riders fanning out below the ridge, torches in hand. He turned to her. "We move once they pass the bluff. There's a dry gulch behind this shack. Leads west to the buttes. You can make it." Her answer was a breath between pain and resolve. "I will." Outside, the lanterns crept closer, their light crawling up the hillside like dawn turned backward. He steadied the rifle, waiting for one mistake, for a shadow to cross the firelight, for a voice to rise above the wind. When the first torch rounded the bluff, he raised the barrel, exhaled once, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night, and the valley answered with shouts. Smoke filled the shack before the echo of the shot died. The cowboy dropped behind the stove as splinters burst from the door. A bullet punched through the wall where his head had been. Outside, riders shouted to spread wide, boots scraping rock. The woman pressed herself against the floorboards, clutching her side. He rechambered the rifle, empty. One cartridge had bought them a heartbeat, nothing more. He reached for the pistol on his belt, found 2 rounds left. "When I say run," he murmured, "you go for the gulch." She shook her head. "You'll be caught. Then they'll have to climb fast." Another shot tore through the window frame. He aimed at the flash beyond the doorway and fired once. A scream followed, short and sharp. The others hesitated. He used the pause to drag her toward the back wall, where the boards had rotted to grey dust. With the butt of his gun, he kicked a hole big enough for her to crawl through. "Go!" She hesitated only a second, then disappeared into the night. He followed, sliding down the slope behind the shack just as the riders charged the front. Muzzle flashes lit the windows, thunder without rain. The shack took the bullets like a dying animal, creaking but standing. They stumbled into the gulch, mud sucking at their boots. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the shadows of the western wall. The narrow ravine twisted between cliffs, dark as a tunnel. Wind howled through it, masking their footsteps. Behind them came the riders' voices again, echoing off stone. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies on the ridge. "They'll circle round," he said. "We keep moving." She leaned heavily against him, but nodded. The fever made her eyes shine too bright. Each breath came rougher than the last. The path narrowed to a slit between boulders. He pushed her through first, then followed on his knees. On the far side, the ground dropped into a dry creek bed. The moon slid out from behind clouds, silvering the world just enough to see the way forward. "Downstream," he said. "The buttes aren't far." They moved through the sand and scrub, keeping close to the cliff wall. Twice they heard riders above them, hooves dislodging pebbles that rattled down like rain. He raised his pistol each time but didn't shoot. Sound would only draw more. After a mile, the creek bent sharply and widened into a basin where ancient cottonwoods clung to life. He guided her beneath one, lowering her to the ground. Her breathing rattled. "We can't stop," she whispered. "We stop, or you bleed out." "Then I bleed." He tore open what was left of the bandage. The wound was bad, angry red lines spreading from the puncture. He packed it with crushed sage leaves from his pouch, one of the few remedies he knew. She watched him work, expression unreadable. "You could leave me here," she said quietly. "No one would blame you." He met her gaze. "I would." A faint crack split the air. A rifle shot, distant but close enough to make both freeze. Bark exploded from the cottonwood trunk. He grabbed her hand. "They found us." They ran. Branches whipped against them, the dry bed turning to loose rock. Lantern light flickered behind, growing brighter. He fired once back into the dark, not aiming, just to make them slow. Echoes rolled through the canyon like thunder trapped underground. Ahead, the creek split again, one arm climbing toward higher ground. He led her upward, scrambling over shale. The slope ended at a narrow shelf that overlooked the valley. Below, half a dozen riders spread out among the trees, torches weaving in patterns of orange light. "They've got dogs," he muttered. A low howl carried up the wind. "We keep climbing." She gripped his sleeve. "You can't fight them all. Don't need to, just need them to think we can." He found a ledge halfway up the rock face and pulled her onto it. From there they could see everything: the torches, the creek, the ruin of the shack still smoldering far behind. Smoke drifted through the moonlight, a ghost of what they'd left behind. He loaded his last bullet and waited. Below, one rider dismounted, pointing toward the slope. Another raised a torch. The flame flared, revealing the glint of steel and the reflection of eyes. Men closing in. He steadied the pistol. "Hope that treaty's worth it," he said softly. "It's worth more than us," she answered. He fired. The nearest torch dropped, rolling into the sand. Shouts erupted, guns flashing. He dragged her deeper into the rocks as bullets sparked off stone. Dust choked the air. When the noise finally fell away, they lay pressed against the cliff, hearts pounding, smoke drifting up to meet the stars. Then came a new sound, the slow groan of earth giving way. The ledge beneath them trembled. He barely had time to grab her before the rock split, and both slid into the darkness below. The fall felt endless until stone and dust rose up to meet them. When the noise settled, the world had gone black except for a thin shaft of moonlight cutting through the crack above. The cowboy tasted blood and grit. His shoulder throbbed. His hat was gone. He rolled to his knees. "Still breathing," he rasped. A soft groan answered from the dark. He crawled toward it, fingers brushing her arm. She was alive, shaken, but alive. "Anything broken?" "Not yet," she said, voice dry as sand. He almost smiled. "Then we keep moving." They were in a sinkhole carved by rain, walls too steep to climb straight. The air smelled of damp earth and stone moss. Far above, torchlight flickered along the rim, riders searching, their voices echoing downward but fading as they moved on. The collapse had swallowed them from sight. For now that was safety enough. He struck a match, cupping it against the wind. The light revealed a narrow passage running off to one side, barely wide enough to crawl. "There's a way out," he said. "Or deeper in," she muttered. "Either beats waiting to be found." They crawled through the tunnel, shoulders scraping stone. Water dripped somewhere ahead. The air grew colder, the sound of the surface lost behind them. After what felt like an hour, the tunnel widened into a cavern. A faint shimmer came from a pool fed by a thin stream trickling through the ceiling. He helped her sit beside it and cupped water in his hands. "Drink slow." She drank, then leaned back against the wall. The fever had left a grey cast on her skin. He tore another strip from his sleeve, soaked it, and laid it across her forehead. The gesture felt almost tender. He caught himself and looked away. "Your shoulder," she said quietly. He glanced down. Blood had soaked through his shirt where rock had torn the skin. "I've had worse." "You talk like a man waiting for worse." He didn't answer. For a time they listened to the water. It filled the silence between them better than words could. Finally she spoke again, her voice low but steady. "When I reach the fort, I'll give them the treaty. Maybe they'll listen this time. Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they'll hang you for reminding them of promises they broke." "Then let them hang me. The words will still be written." He looked at her, half in admiration, half in disbelief. "You believe that paper can change what men are?" "No," she said. but it can remind them what they were supposed to be. A rumble passed through the ground, distant thunder or shifting stone. Pebbles dropped from the ceiling. He helped her to her feet. "We need daylight before this place buries us." They followed the stream until it climbed toward a narrow slit of blue. By dawn, they crawled out into open air at the base of a canyon, miles west of where they'd fallen. The first sun touched the ridges like fire on bronze. They rested under a ledge. The wind carried no pursuit now, only the cry of hawks. He tore his last piece of jerky in half and handed it to her. She broke it smaller, offering part back. "Share it," she said. He took it without a word. After eating, he climbed a short rise to scan the horizon. Smoke rose far behind them, maybe campfires, maybe the shack still burning. Ahead, the land opened toward a salt flat, and beyond that, the faint line of cottonwoods marking the river again. 2 days' ride, he murmured, if we had horses. When he returned, she was asleep, head resting against her pack. He watched the rise and fall of her breath, then turned his gaze westward once more. The treaty, the riders, the blood, it all felt smaller under that endless sky. Still, the sound of hoofbeats haunted the back of his mind, a rhythm that never stopped. By midday, heat shimmered across the sand. He lifted her to her feet. "We move when it's hardest to track," he said. "Even the sun can't burn forever," she answered. They set off again, 2 figures crossing the white plain, their shadows long behind them. Each step ground pain into bone, but neither spoke of turning back. Somewhere beyond the horizon waited either the fort or the men who didn't want them to reach it. Above, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke from the east. He looked over his shoulder, but saw nothing, just the trembling air. The woman followed his gaze. "They still come." "Always," he said. "But so do we." They walked on until the sun began to bleed into the mountains, and the earth ahead glowed red as the wound they both carried. The light faded, leaving only their footprints stretching west, proof that for one more day neither mercy nor memory had died. By the second day, the flats shimmered like a silver sea under the noon sun. Heat rose in waves, bending the horizon until sky and sand seemed the same color. The cowboy walked ahead, eyes narrowed against the glare, the woman following close behind. Their footprints stretched out behind them, a trail of ghosts. The land gave nothing freely. What little water they carried had gone warm, tasting of iron. Each sip came with guilt. He rationed it between them, 3 swallows for her, 1 for himself. She never argued, though he could see the tremor in her hands when she passed the canteen back. By afternoon, the ground hardened into salt crust that cracked under their boots. The woman stumbled once, catching herself on his arm. "The sun hunts harder than men," she whispered. He nodded. "And it never misses." A line of low rock offered shade enough for both to crouch. He used his knife to scratch a mark on the stone, a habit born from lost trails. She watched, head tilted. "You mark where you've been, so I remember how far not to go again." Her lips curved faintly. "My people mark where they will return. Then maybe you'll teach me how." For the first time in days, she smiled, small, genuine, gone as quickly as it came. When they moved again, wind rose from the west, carrying dust that stung their eyes, a storm brewing, the kind that could erase tracks or bury them outright. He scanned the distance until he spotted a line of black cliffs. "There," he said, "shelter if we reach it before dark." They pressed on. The storm hit halfway, sand whipping sideways, sky turned copper. He tore his bandana in 2, giving her half to cover her face. Visibility shrank to arm's length. They found the cliff by sound, hearing the wind strike it like surf against rock. A narrow cleft offered cover. They collapsed inside, coughing dust. When the wind finally eased, the world outside had changed shape. The dunes had shifted, their tracks gone. The woman unwrapped her face, eyes red but clear. "We're ghosts now," she said. He wiped sand from his beard. "Let's hope they can't track ghosts." Night fell cold. He built a small fire behind a boulder, flames no taller than his hand. She sat close, warming her fingers. The quiet between them no longer felt like fear. It felt earned. After a while, she said, "In my tribe, stories are payment. You save a life, you owe a story." He stared into the fire. "You sure you want mine?" "Yes." He thought for a long time. "I once rode with men who burned a village, said it was justice. I called it duty. Been trying to outride that smoke ever since." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe this trail is your circle closing." Her words settled over them like ash, soft, unarguable. Outside, coyotes called across the flats, and the echo carried something almost like prayer. At dawn, they followed a dry wash toward the distant line of cottonwoods. The air smelled of water again, thin but real. By midday, they reached a shallow spring trickling from limestone. He knelt, filled the canteen, and handed it to her first. She drank, then poured a little onto the ground. "For those who didn't make it," she said. He bowed his head. "Fair share." They rested under the trees, both too tired to speak. In the distance, thunder rolled. Not weather this time, but artillery from the fort. The woman met his eyes. "We're close." He tightened the strap on his rifle. Close can be the most dangerous place of all. The sun lowered behind them, turning the salt flats gold. Ahead lay the river and the uncertain promise of law, peace, or betrayal. For now they walked side by side, the wind carrying their footprints forward, until even those disappeared into light. By the time they reached the cottonwoods, the river had grown broad and sluggish, heavy with silt from the mountains. Across the water, they could see the outline of the fort, palisade walls rising pale against the sky, a flag barely moving in the still air. Smoke from cook fires drifted upward, so calm it seemed to hang there forever. The cowboy stopped at the edge of the bank. "That's as far as I've gone in years," he said. "Why?" she asked. "Too many ghosts waiting inside those walls." The woman knelt and touched the water. "Then the circle is almost closed." He studied her reflection beside his own, broken by ripples. "Once you give them that treaty, they'll put your name on a ledger, same as any prisoner. You know that." "They can cage my body," she said. Not the words. He didn't argue. Truth had a way of sounding simple when it came from her mouth. They built a small camp beneath the trees, hidden from view of the sentry towers. He cut strips of jerky with his knife, passing half across the fire. The quiet between them was no longer uneasy. It carried the weight of decisions not yet spoken. After a while, she asked, "If they offer you silver for my capture, will you take it?" He stared into the firelight. "Used to think silver fixed everything. Now I know it just shines over rot. That sounds like a story my people tell. Maybe truth speaks both languages." They fell silent again. The night wrapped around them, full of insects and river wind. From across the water came the faint sound of a bugle, its call long and lonely. She closed her eyes. "They'll send patrols at dawn. If I go alone, they may listen. And if they don't, then the words die with me. And that's still better than war without end." He shook his head. "You don't owe them your blood. I owe the next child born on this land a chance to live without fear." He couldn't answer that. Somewhere inside him, the old soldier still measured right and wrong by orders. Now there were only choices, and each one cost the same. Toward midnight, distant lightning flared behind the hills. He watched it dance along the horizon, counting the seconds until thunder followed. The storm was moving east, toward the fort. He took it as a sign. "Storm will cover you," he said. "Use the noise to cross. I'll draw their eyes upstream." Her brow furrowed. "You'll be shot." "Maybe. Maybe they'll just chase the wrong shadow." She looked at him a long time, then reached into her pouch and drew out a small folded paper wrapped in oilskin. The treaty. "If you live, give this to someone who remembers mercy." He took it, feeling how fragile it was, lighter than dust. "You're trusting the wrong man." "No," she said. "I'm trusting the one still here." When the first drops of rain fell, he helped her wade into the shallows, water rising to their knees. Lightning turned the river white, thunder rolling close behind. "Wait for my shot," he said, "then move." She gripped his wrist once, firm and brief. "Ride the circle true." He climbed the bank and moved upriver, rifle ready, heart pounding with the rhythm of the storm. Behind him, he heard the faint splash of her crossing. At the right moment, He fired into the air, one echoing crack that split the rain. Lanterns flared along the fort wall. Shouts carried over the water. He ducked behind a fallen log, reloading by instinct though the rifle was empty. Men rushed toward the sound. Through the curtain of rain, he glimpsed her figure reach the far shore, vanish into reeds, then reappear climbing the slope toward the fort's dark gate. For a heartbeat she turned, looking back across the river. He raised a hand, though he doubted she could see it through the downpour. Then the bugle sounded again, sharper this time. The gate opened. Torches swarmed. Whether they came to save her or seize her, he couldn't tell. All he knew was that the circle had finally closed. One soul heading toward judgment, the other fading into rain. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and walked west into the storm. The treaty pressed against his chest, the river washing his footprints clean behind him. By morning the storm had passed, leaving the world rinsed clean and brittle. Mist hung over the river like breath. The cowboy stood on the western bank, watching the fort emerge from the fog, timbers dark with rain, sentries moving along the wall. Smoke rose from the chimneys, thin and steady again. No gunfire, no shouting, only the sound of water finding its way downstream. He turned the oil-wrapped paper in his hands. The ink inside was safe, though the edges had curled. A treaty meant to end a war, carried through fire, rain, and blood. He tucked it inside his coat and started north along the riverbank, keeping the fort always in sight but out of reach. Tracks cut fresh in the mud. Horses had ridden out at dawn. He followed them until he reached a bluff overlooking the gate. Below, soldiers moved among tents. Near the stables, he spotted a figure wrapped in a grey blanket, seated beside a medic's wagon. Even from that distance he knew the posture, upright despite exhaustion, proud despite chains. The Apache woman. He sank to one knee behind the rocks, unsure whether relief or anger filled him more. She was alive, but they had not let her walk free. Two officers stood over her, talking low. When she raised her head, he saw the faint glint of defiance still in her eyes. He waited until the officers left, then circled down through the scrub to the rear fence. The guards on that side were half asleep, rifles leaning against the wall. He could slip close enough to speak if he chose, but what would he say? He had no proof of anything except her courage and the paper in his coat. A bugle called the men to muster. In the noise, he stepped from cover and crossed the last few yards. She saw him first. A flicker of recognition passed over her face, gone before the guard noticed. "You shouldn't be here," she said under her breath. "Came to finish what you started." They took the words. "No," he said, touching his chest. "Still have them." Her eyes softened, the first warmth he had seen since the canyon. "Then ride. Give them to someone who listens." He hesitated. "You'll hang for treason." "Maybe. But if the words live, that's enough." Boots scraped behind him. The nearest guard turned, eyes narrowing. The cowboy stepped back slowly, pretending to adjust his hat. "Just a stable hand looking for tack," he said in his roughest drawl. The guard grunted and turned away. When he looked back once more, she was gone. Led inside the infirmary, blanket trailing like a banner of ash. He left before the gates closed. By noon, he reached the ridge road leading west. The sky had cleared, bright and endless. Every hoofprint from the storm was already drying into dust. At a crossroads, he found a mail courier mending a wheel. The man nodded a greeting. "Road's clear to Red Mesa," he said. "You heading that way?" "Farther," the cowboy answered. He reached into his coat, pulled out the folded treaty, and handed it over. "Deliver this to the mission near the mesa. To the preacher there, he'll know what to do." The courier looked puzzled. "No payment." "Only the promise that it reaches him." The man studied the seal, saw the military crest faint beneath the grime, and gave a low whistle. "Reckon I can make sure of that." "Good." The cowboy touched the brim of his hat. "Ride fast." He watched until the wagon disappeared into heat shimmer. For the first time in years, he felt something like ease. Maybe the words would matter. Maybe they wouldn't. But they'd travel farther than either of them could now. He turned his horse, one he'd stolen from an abandoned corral, and rode into the hills. Each mile carried him farther from the fort, from the law, from every name he'd ever worn. Behind him, thunder muttered across the plains again, gentle this time, as if the land itself exhaled. Toward evening he camped beneath a lone juniper. The sun dropped red behind the mesas, and the first stars came out one by one. He built no fire, only watched the horizon until the fort's lights vanished entirely. The wind whispered through the grass like water over stone. He thought of her then, how she'd spoken of circles, of stories that bound one life to another. He hoped she'd survive to tell hers. He hoped someone would listen. When he finally lay back, the earth was cool beneath him and the sky vast enough to swallow guilt. Tomorrow the trail would turn south or west. He hadn't decided. For tonight, it was enough to breathe without fear, to feel the weight of the past lifting like dust in the morning wind. And somewhere behind him, carried by river and road, a folded paper moved toward hands that might yet believe in peace. The trail climbed into higher country, where juniper gave way to pine and the air thinned with altitude. The cowboy rode in silence, following a faint wagon track that twisted through canyons washed clean by the storm. Every hooffall echoed like a clock. The days of dust and blood already felt like another lifetime, but he carried their weight in every motion. By the third evening, he reached a narrow pass overlooking Red Mesa. Below, the land fell away to a plain of red stone and scrub, and in its center stood the mission, a white cross on a low hill, catching the last sunlight. He dismounted, stretching stiff legs. The courier's tracks led straight down the slope. The message would be delivered by now, he thought. Still, part of him needed to be sure. He rode on as dusk turned violet. At the mission gate, a bell tolled once, slow and deep. A young friar met him with cautious eyes. "So you from the fort?" "Just passing through." The friar nodded toward the chapel. "Father Thomas is inside. He's been expecting someone." Inside smelled of candle smoke and rain-soaked stone. The preacher stood near the altar, holding the very parchment the cowboy had given away. He looked up as Boots crossed the threshold. "You're the messenger." "Only by accident." Thomas studied him a moment, then said, "These words speak of peace." "Hard to believe men still try to write such things." The cowboy shrugged. "One woman did, carried it farther than anyone thought she could." "Where is she?" "Taken at the fort. Alive, last I saw." The preacher folded the paper carefully. "Then the hardest part's left to me." "What's that?" "Making men listen." They spoke little more. The cowboy left the chapel before dawn, the tolling bell fading behind him. He didn't ride far, just to the edge of the mesa where he could watch the first light spread across the plain. The world looked endless again, and for the first time he wondered what it might be like to live without running. Later that day, he found the tracks of a small patrol heading north from the fort. 3 horses, 1 wagon. He followed at a distance until twilight, when the sound of a cough carried on the wind. He crept close enough to see 2 soldiers, and between them in the wagon bed, a woman wrapped in a gray blanket. His chest tightened. The same woman. They were taking her somewhere, north, maybe to another post. He could have turned away. He almost did. But the memory of her voice, the calm certainty that words mattered, kept him still. When the soldiers made camp, he waited until their fire burned low. Then he led his horse through the scrub and whistled once, low and sharp. The nearer guard stood, peering into the dark. A second later, the cowboy stepped from the shadows, gun drawn. "Easy," he said. "Nobody dies if nobody's stupid." The men froze. One reached for his rifle. The cowboy fired into the dirt at his feet. "Next one won't miss." The other soldier lifted his hands. "We've got orders." "Not anymore." He made them toss their weapons aside and back away from the wagon. The woman sat upright now, eyes wide but steady. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "Seems I keep doing what I shouldn't." He cut the ropes around her wrists and handed her the reins. "Take the wagon south to the mission, they'll keep you safe. And you?" "I'll ride the other way. Give them something to chase." Before she could answer, he slapped the wagon horse's flank. The wheels lurched forward, scattering dust. He swung onto his own mount and spurred east toward the open desert. Behind him, the soldiers shouted and scrambled for their rifles. A shot cracked, another. None found their mark. The wagon vanished into the dark. He rode until moonlight silvered the rocks and the sound of pursuit thinned to nothing. The desert stretched around him, silent except for wind through mesquite. He slowed the horse, breath coming hard. Somewhere behind him, she would reach the mission. Ahead, only wilderness waited. He stopped at a ridge and looked back. The horizon glowed faintly with the fort's distant fires. Between them lay miles of empty land and, maybe, the thin thread of peace she had carried. He wondered if it would hold. He turned his horse toward the mountains and rode on, each hoofbeat echoing like a promise not yet kept. Morning found the cowboy deep in the uplands, where the air thinned and the trees smelled of resin. He rode until his horse trembled, then dismounted and led it through the switchbacks. Behind him lay a faint column of smoke from the patrol's fire. They hadn't given up. Ahead stretched a maze of ravines that few men crossed twice. It would buy time. He stopped beside a trickle of water and let the horse drink. His hands shook from fatigue more than fear. He hadn't slept since the raid at the wagon. The woman's face lingered in his thoughts, not as a ghost now, but as a direction. South to the mission, east to the fort, west to nowhere. He wondered which path Mercy followed. By midday the trail forked again, one branch leading higher into cloud, the other curling toward the plains. He chose the high route. Storm clouds were building over the peaks. Rain would hide his scent and prints. As he climbed, thunder rolled like distant drums. The scent of pine and ozone filled the air. He reached a plateau by late afternoon, a wide table of stone ringed with cliffs. From its edge he could see the land he'd crossed, red earth, pale rivers, the line of cottonwoods near the fort reduced to a smudge of green. It looked small, almost peaceful from here. He wondered if the treaty had reached any hands that could still read without bitterness. A rustle broke the stillness. He turned, pistol half drawn, but it was only a rider cresting the slope, one of the soldiers, alone, rifle across the saddle. The man spotted him and waved, shouting something lost to the wind. No choice now but to meet it head-on. They closed the distance cautiously, eyes locked. The soldier was young, barely more than a boy, face burned raw by sun and rain. "You the one who took the prisoner," he called. The cowboy kept his gun low. "She was never yours to take. She's property of the territory. Orders say return or kill." "Orders change," the cowboy said. "Words don't." The boy hesitated, confused. "You talk like a preacher. Just a tired man." Lightning flashed close enough to make both horses rear. In the glare, the cowboy saw fear in the boy's eyes. Fear, not hate. He seized the moment. "Go home," he said. "Tell them you lost me in the storm. They'll court-martial me. Better that than dying for someone else's lie." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the soldier lowered his rifle. "You'll run out of land up here." "Maybe," the cowboy said, "but I'll choose where it ends." The boy turned his horse downslope, vanishing into the first sheets of rain. Thunder swallowed the sound of hooves. The cowboy holstered his gun and let the storm come. Rain fell hard, washing the dust from his coat and the salt from his face. He lifted his head into it, letting the cold sting his skin. Somewhere below, he imagined the wagon reaching the mission, the paper unrolled, the preacher reading words that might finally bend the world a fraction closer to right. When night came, he built a small fire in a cave near the plateau's rim. The horse stood just inside the entrance, flanks steaming. He tore a scrap from his saddlebag, an old wanted notice with his own name faded across it, and fed it to the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and was gone. Outside, wind carried the smell of wet stone and cedar. He thought about circles again, hers drawn by duty, his by regret. Maybe both would close in the same place. As he drifted towards sleep, a flicker of light caught his eye. A lantern moving along the lower trail, followed by another. The patrol hadn't turned back after all. He rose, dousing the fire with his boot. In the sudden dark, only the storm's rhythm remained. He saddled up, tightening the cinch with steady hands. The mountains echoed with distant voices carried on the wind. They were climbing fast. He looked once more toward the valley, where the mission light glimmered faintly through rain. Then he whispered to the horse, and they slipped into the blackness between lightning strikes, heading higher still, toward the edge of the world, and whatever waited beyond. The storm had grown into a wall of wind and rain by the time the cowboy reached the highest ridge. Clouds pressed against the cliff, heavy and low, lightning striking jagged rocks around him. Every step on slick stone threatened a fall. Below the valley stretched endless and grey, the river a silver thread reflecting flashes of lightning. Somewhere in that distance, the mission awaited, carrying the woman and the treaty. He paused, hands gripping the reins, listening. The wind carried a faint sound, hooves, now unmistakable, pounding closer up the slope. The patrol had found him, only 3 men, but desperate, and he was alone. One wrong move would throw him from the ridge to the rocks below. He dismounted and crouched behind a boulder, the pistol heavy in his hand. Rain plastered hair to his forehead, soaked his coat, made the weapon slippery. The first rider appeared, lantern bobbing, water running off his hat. The cowboy fired once, not to kill, only to signal. The bullet struck rock at his feet. Sparks flew. The man froze. Lightning flared again, illuminating all 3 riders, one advancing straight toward him, one circling the left, and the last moving slowly along the slope above, trying to block escape. The cowboy's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed to run, but he had no ground for retreat. The edge was sharp, cliffs dropping into mist. He thought of the woman, safe now, the treaty delivered, her trust placed in the mission. Every step he'd taken, every choice he'd made, had been for her. He could not fail now. Mercy demanded a reckoning, and he would meet it on his terms. The first rider raised his rifle. The cowboy fired again, striking the cliff beside him, a warning shot that rang like thunder. The man hesitated. He lunged forward, pistol low, forcing the second rider back with the same show of force. Lightning illuminated the ground as water cascaded around them, transforming the ridge into a narrow river of mud and stone. The final rider circled above, shouting commands, but the wind swallowed his words. The cowboy's voice cut through the storm anyway. Leave now or fall behind. Another flash revealed the patrol's uncertainty. The ground beneath their hooves was treacherous. One misstep, and the rocks would claim them. A rolling boulder dislodged by the storm tumbled past, scattering mud and water across the path. The first rider cursed, slipping on wet stone, and the second turned back to assist. The cowboy pressed the advantage, moving forward, weapon ready. With each step, he edged closer to the high point, a narrow ridge that curved toward a natural overhang. Lightning struck the cliff face just above him, illuminating the vast emptiness beyond the precipice. The wind tore at his coat. He could hear the patrol scrambling, shouts drowned in the storm. He sprinted, feet sliding, balancing, adrenaline carrying him farther than his body thought possible. Reaching the overhang, he vaulted forward, landing in a shallow depression shielded by boulders. Water ran over him, thunder masking the sound of movement below. The riders paused at the edge, voices lost to wind. Lightning struck again, revealing him crouched in the shelter of stone. The world held its breath. Then the first rider slipped, legs giving way in the mud. A cry echoed. The second tried to save him, but another flash revealed the treacherous slope. One by one, they stumbled, scrambling back, away from the cliff's edge, and eventually gave up pursuit, disappearing into the mist. The cowboy stayed still, listening to the storm's roar. Behind him, the ridge was empty, the chase ended. Relief didn't come immediately, only the knowledge that the high ground had kept him alive. He rose slowly, scanning the valley below. Through the rain and fog, the mission's white cross gleamed faintly. She had reached safety. The treaty had survived. For the first time in days, the weight on his chest lifted. His hands ached. His clothes were soaked. His muscles screamed. But the choice he had made to protect, to risk, to act with mercy, had carried him through. He knelt on the wet stone, breathing in the cold, electric air. Somewhere below, beyond sight and hearing, life continued. Messengers, soldiers, and those who would carry words forward. Thunder rumbled once more, distant and soft, as if acknowledging the conclusion. The cowboy allowed himself to stand fully, gaze tracing the line of the ridge and the path he had carved. The storm would fade, the river would flow, and the wind would erase the prints of pursuit. He had survived the storm, the soldiers, and the cliffs. Now only the horizon remained. He mounted his horse, hooves slipping briefly on the wet stone. The animal trembled, but they both steadied. He looked west toward open desert and mountain passes, toward any future that would not be dictated by the fort or the patrols or the weight of orders. With one deep breath, he urged the horse forward. The storm had passed. The ridge and the river behind him carried only memory. The cowboy rode into the rain-soaked light, leaving the ridge and the echoes of the storm behind. Ahead lay the vast untamed land, the promise of freedom, and the quiet knowledge that the choices made in the storm had preserved not only a life, but a circle that could continue beyond him. The sun rose pale and slow, brushing the mesas with soft gold. The cowboy rode along a narrow ridge, horse-picking its way over slick stone, every step measured and deliberate. Below him stretched the desert, empty but alive with wind and distant birdsong. The storm had faded entirely. Only mud and scattered debris marked the battle fought against nature and men alike. He paused at the edge of a small plateau, overlooking a creek. The water glimmered in the morning light, carrying the memory of the rainstorm down to the river beyond. Somewhere along that river, she had reached safety. The thought brought a quiet satisfaction. A weight lifted from his chest. The paper she had carried, the treaty, had reached hands that might honor it, and in that small success, the cowboy felt the world tilt slightly toward justice. The ridge trail wound eastward toward higher ground. He rode slowly, letting the horse find its footing. Each mile carried him farther from the fort, from orders, from the pursuit that had dogged him for days. In the distance, a hawk circled the cliffs, silent and patient, wings cutting the wind. He watched it for a long moment, seeing in its flight the freedom he had fought for, not just for her, but for himself. Memories of the canyon, the river crossing, the collapsing ledge, and the high ridge all returned, a montage of decisions that balanced risk, courage, and mercy. The adrenaline of pursuit was gone, replaced by reflection. He thought of the woman's words about circles, about stories carrying life beyond one's own hands. She had trusted him with more than safety. She had trusted him with the future. The cowboy let his eyes sweep the horizon. The mesas glowed amber in the early light, shadows long across the flats. A single cloud drifted overhead, slow and drifting, indifferent to human concerns. He felt small in its vastness, yet connected to every choice, every action that had brought them here. Life in the desert demanded decisions that bore consequences, and for once, he had acted with purpose beyond mere survival. By noon, he reached a dry wash that would lead him toward the southern trails. He paused one last time, looking back toward the fort far in the distance. No smoke, no pursuing riders, only the faint trail of the river and the distant glint of sun on the mission's roof. A moment of quiet triumph passed between him and the land itself, a shared acknowledgement that justice, though fragile, had survived the storm. He remounted and urged the horse forward. The trail ahead was long and uncertain, but he rode with the knowledge that his actions had mattered. The land was vast, wild, and untamed, but it had witnessed courage and mercy. Somewhere out there, she would live to tell the story, to carry the words, and to prove that even amidst danger, honor could endure. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows behind him. He rode on into the warm glow of evening, the desert stretching endlessly, carrying him forward into a future shaped not by fear but by the choices he had made. If you've followed this journey, you've witnessed a tale of courage, trust, and the power of choices in the face of impossible odds. The cowboy and the Apache woman remind us that even in the harshest landscapes, where danger and uncertainty are constant companions, mercy, resilience, and moral conviction can shape a story that endures. Stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders of the human spirit's ability to persevere, to make difficult decisions, and to act with integrity when the world seems indifferent. If you felt the tension, the relief, or the triumph in this tale, there's more where it came from. Subscribe and follow along for more cinematic Western adventures, where every choice matters, every action has weight, and every story leaves a mark. Step into worlds of survival, courage, and redemption. You never know where the next trail will lead.